Okay, so we're in there. Awesome. Okay, so let me get back to my screen. All right. All right, guys. So I would just want to welcome everybody into this space today. First of all, thank you for being patient with us. We are here. I'm so excited to be in the space with such brilliant scholars today. And before we get started, I just want to talk about the title. So the title of this conversation is COVID-19 and Black Lives Matter, Creating Pathways for Change in Urban Education. We've seen a lot of conversations happening now with the state of what's happening in our nation and just globally. And we really want to talk about what's going on from a Newark perspective. And shout out to Newark, because Newark is this really dynamic place. And I feel so blessed to be in conversation with these dope scholars. Before we get started, I really want to start by saying the names of those folks who have been leadered. I think it's very important that we have their names in the conversation. Maurice Gordon, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd. Okay, we want to say those names and we want to make those names heard, because since the pandemic started, we've seen how the intersections of police brutality and healthcare, right, education have really been just clashing. And the conversations remain separate in some ways, and we really want to have an intersectional approach to what is going on. And so we also want to shout out Black trans lives. You know, there are many ways that Black trans lives are getting lost as part of this conversation. And we really want to acknowledge our trans folks who have lost their lives in this struggle as well, okay? So we have Dominique Phelps, right? We want to say their names, right? We want to acknowledge what has happened to them, okay? So first I want to talk a little bit. My name is Belle, and I'm the director of the Urban Teacher Education Program at Rutgers-Newark. Our program is really grounded in a social justice vision and mission. And we have really been seeing how our program was directly impacted. So most of our students are student teachers in Newark, New Jersey, and we saw disparities faced on, and Dr. Wingfield will speak more to this, where suddenly it was like, okay, teach them online. And then, you know, we found out that there were young people who don't have internet access, right? We also experienced a lot of extreme state demands. Well, make them finish their hours, right? So the state was on us to really get this completed without really acknowledging the fact that students were in different situations now. And our student teachers, many of whom are first generation, were also struggling. Many of my students had family members who lost their lives to COVID-19. And I had people asking me questions like, okay, what's their grades like? Well, they have a family member who is suffering from COVID-19, right? So what does that look like? And so I think it's really important to think about us programmatically seeing our student teachers, seeing the students that they serve being impacted, but still having these state requirements and these mandates, and the university asking us, what are we gonna do, right? But you don't really have a chance to process the pain that you're experiencing, right? Because even though you're a leader and you're in education, you are still feeling what's happening. You may know someone who has COVID-19 or know someone who lost their lives to COVID-19. And so as Dr. Wingfield and I were having these conversations, we thought, let's really get to the meat of this. So I want to address some of my panelists. So that's kind of the meat of this conversation and what it's going to be. I want to address some of my other panelists. We have Dr. Jhanae Wingfield, who is our clinical supervisor for the Rutgers-Newark UTEP program. We also have Dr. Kisha Porcher, who is an assistant professor at the University of Delaware. And we have Dr. Yolanda Mendez, who is from Newark Public Schools and who is the executive director of human resources. We work really closely with NPS to ensure, first and foremost, that our students are teaching in Newark Public Schools, because we really foster our students to work in Newark Public Schools. And we also want to really think about what is the future of urban education, okay? So I want to start with some questions, and I specifically want to get into some clinical questions. So I'm going to start with Dr. Wingfield. Dr. Wingfield, what would you say was one of the most pertinent things you noticed when COVID-19 started and how it impacted clinical specifically?
So I think first speaking specifically to our program as a program that's really rooted in social justice, as a program that talks about institutional and structural racism, that talks about oppression, that talks about the marginalization of the students that we work with, not just in our institution, but in our partnership with Newark Public Schools, that we were already having some of these conversations. I think what COVID-19 and the some of the unrest that we're experiencing right now with the rebellions across the country have done, it's just exacerbated some of the conversations we were already having. But then thinking about our immediate and direct impact that we experienced was one, teacher certification. So we encountered a lot of challenges with that. And one of the things that are most important to us in our partnership with Newark Public Schools is to try to really address some of the schools that have these high vacancies. So we're preparing teachers to be in these spaces. We're giving them the tools and attempting to equip them with the skill set to work in these school settings. But then we're encountering the challenges with the state and getting teachers certified as they're asking for synchronous evidence of teaching, right, within these school communities. And on the other side, we're partnering with Newark Public Schools to say, hey, how can we be of greater assistance in just reaching students and ensuring that our students that we should be teaching are showing up in the spaces, but also teaching our teachers at the same time how to teach using remote learning, right? So that's just one huge piece of it. I think too, with our students in particular, this was the time where they really had to show up and apply all of the theory and pedagogy that we've been talking about. So it's one thing to talk about it. It's one thing to have discussions around grades. Are grades data points? Are grades punitive? But then you have to then decide what that looks like when you're experiencing COVID, when you're having difficulty reaching families or students and thinking about what that looks like. So those are some of the immediate impacts that we experienced working with our students. I think moving forward, because even though our students graduated, we continue to maintain the relationship with them. And I've been having conversations with them. So moving forward, we're really thinking about how can we anticipate some of these challenges, right? So in our head, we're in our classes and we're teaching undo, abolish, but at the same time, we're really giving them the skill set to navigate what's happening right now. So I think moving forward is really thinking about how are we giving them the skills to navigate what's happening right here in the moment, but how are we also teaching these pre-service teachers how to show up as advocates and organizers in order to create more equitable learning environments, because COVID-19, it really has given us some space to reimagine what schools can look like.
I love that. Yeah, and I think it's really important, right, to really talk about, when major events like COVID-19 happens, I think where schools are failing, especially from an education perspective, is we are not given time to process what is happening.
Correct.
And similar to the state, there's this very go, do, and that's capitalism too, right? And I think that our institutions also kind of feed into that, because I know institutionally, the question was, well, what is the plan? And it was just like, nobody knew what was happening. And so I also think that we need to create spaces for not knowing. We don't know, right? So these conversations are a pathway to knowing some things. And I think in education, especially in urban education, what could happen if we said, you know what, I don't know. Let's figure it out. Let's pause. And this fear of pausing is tied to this capitalist go, do, rush, go. So I want to get to Dr. Porcher for this question. What was the first thing you noticed when the outbreak happened for you professionally? Like, how did that impact your day-to-day?
So thank you so much for bringing that piece up, Dr. Belle, about how we are pushed to just keep going. And I've always known that especially educational spaces for Black and Brown children are dehumanizing, right? And so this idea of let's get to work, let's create a plan, when no one took the time to just say, are you okay? Right? And so the first few weeks of my class, I didn't talk about what we were going to work on, I needed to know if my students were alive, if their parents were alive, if they were in a safe space. A lot of our students were forced to move off of campus immediately, right? And so some of them were from out of state and had nowhere to go, or international students and had nowhere to go. So as much as people were pushing to say, hey, what are we going to do next? All I wanted to do was humanize the experience. So I wanted to check in with my students. And that was a part of the work that I do anyway, because I feel that we have become so accustomed to just going from one step to the next step. And my students will tell you that every single class, I take the moment to speak to them individually, ask them how their day was going. But then I had to take it up a notch where I just created space for my students to vent about what they were feeling at the time, right? And I think about the many Black and brown children that come into school spaces and they're traumatized already, be it from poverty, racism, white supremacy, and we're expecting them to just come into another space that is also filled with these isms and just keep going with no space to really process how that works, right? And so, not to mention the Black faculty that are now in charge of teaching in these spaces, where we've always had to kind of hush our tongues and not really say how we knew that the spaces were dehumanizing to begin with, now are being called to create the plans and try to dismantle a system that we never built to begin with, right? And so I think that we've had to have some critical conversations in a way. And let me be clear, we've been having these conversations since the inception. It's just now that it's impacting white people in a larger audience, everyone feels like it's time to have a conversation about it. But all of the Black teachers and all of the Black students and Black parents who have been saying this since its inception, like, this doesn't work for us. No one heard them. They were fired. They were moved out or pushed out or blacked out, right? And so now we want to invite them to the table to say, hey, can you now give us that plan that you talked about 20 years ago, not thinking about the trauma that is already upon our lives. So I think for me, I love the idea of saying, no, we need to pause. But because we live in a capitalist society, our first inclination is to figure out how we can now make money off of Black bodies. I've seen so many organizations, like, I do anti-racist work. I'm like, do you? Because I remember showing up in your space and you never talked about what was happening to Black and brown children. So there is a moment to pause for a lot of people to say that we don't know this work, but at the same time, do not put the pressure on Black people to attempt to dismantle a system that we never created.
I love that. I love all of that, Dr. Porcher. And you touched on so many things. I feel like I really got to talk about it because, we are all women of color in this space, in this virtual space. And I know that I speak as a Black woman, yes, right? So in the space of higher ed, where you're expected to keep mom, and this is why I thought this conversation was so important, right? You're expected to keep mom, you're treated as invisible, but then when something like this happens, you're also expected to create new programming, right? And roll out the red carpet and come tell us about culturally responsive pedagogy. And, shout out to the scholars who do this work for real, but I also want to say there is a responsibility for all of us, every color, to do this work. And we cannot expect Black and brown folk to kind of shoulder the weight of this work. And to me, that's what I'm seeing. Since the intersection of Black Lives Matter, we're now even heavier with all the murders happening, right? We just have this young girl, right? And I don't want to mess up her name because I want to make sure I'm pronouncing it right. But Oluwatoyin, right? You have this 19-year-old activist who's tweeting, who's there, who is a Black woman, right? Who's suddenly murdered, right? So like that voice is taken away. And the next day you have to teach, right? And like, how do you do that? Why are you expected to do that? Or why are you expected to have this prolific statement? The statement is it hurts. The statement is I'm tired, right? The statement is that our students and our communities are suffering. And what are we going to do? Right? And so thank you for kind of addressing all of those intersections. And I think as we think about the future, we need to think about a future where that labor is shouldered, right? That this anti-racist work is for everybody, and it cannot be on the onus of scholars who do this work or teachers who do this work. We all have to do this work. And I think that's what I'm hoping will eventually happen. I'm an optimist. I also want to say to folks, if you have any pressing questions, just put it in the comments and we'll get to it at the end. I do want to go over to Dr. Mendez right now and ask from the NPS side, how do you feel like, how is NPS impacted, right? As Newark Public Schools, how were you guys impacted when COVID first broke out? And what were some of the systems in place to handle everything that went on and that is still going on?
So first of all, thank you so much for having me here. And ladies, just powerful, powerful sharings as far as the reality and just being able, just the thought that two individuals such as these are supporting the equipping of some of our prospective teachers is just amazing as I look at in my space to try to really make sure that we have a good cadre of talent that is ready to join an urban setting. But as far as COVID, I have to say that initially the superintendent, and greetings on behalf of the superintendent did a very, very good job as far as making sure that the instructional prerogative was the most important, safety always, but making sure that there was planning so that our students right away, teachers, administrators didn't skip a beat. The minute that schools were closed, we already had 2 to 4 weeks of plans ready to roll out into the classrooms so that the educators on the educator end, at least what we needed for them was there. We had, I think Dr. Belle, I think is very timely and very interesting, the portion that you mentioned as far as being sensitive to the fact that not all our students had the technology. And some of our staff may not have had the technology, and immediately the superintendent went hit that head on, and there was very supportive of making sure we had both items in print, and also made, as we were trying to prepare to make sure that we had available technology so that we can get as close to one-to-one technology as we could. And I'm happy to say that based on all the superintendent's efforts, we were able to get a lot of donations and foundations who supported us as far as making sure that all children and all families who needed internet connection had it. The technology internally, eventually we were able to scaffold within, I would say within the first 3 to 4 weeks of being out of the school, we were able to go into a more paperless system, but always knowing that if in an environment where the technology is foreign, we are always sensitive to the student that may need it in writing, and also, or on paper, or also those who have disabilities or what have you, were just the more visual and tactile and so forth. All of those items were items that we were really just struggling with on a daily basis. Although I'm just very proud to be representing HR. I am an educator at heart. That's where I started, and that's where my heart is. We really, in addressing the problem, I think what the superintendent did, which was just such great forethought, is he was ahead of the game, making sure that we tried to have all of those bases covered. Everything from just being the only school district. I mean, we were, by the first week that we were closed, food was being provided on a regular basis to all of our families, or any of our families that needed that, because you can't really equip a child to learn when he's thinking about feeding himself, or right, a parent to be able to support a child. And when we think about, and this is not just an urban dilemma, although we see it more than probably we would want to, unfortunately, for the obvious reasons, the superintendent was so sensitive to that from the very beginning, he knew that he would have a commitment to making sure our schools were open. We ended up having 14 sites, and we still, those sites are still available to parents who may be struggling and may not have a job, may have been struggling prior to the closing of the pandemic. And we made sure that we were offering food and support and everything from the technology that we need to continue, so we wouldn't skip a beat, because the important thing is to equip the child with what they need. However, what they needed too was some supports as far as clothing and food and all of that stuff, and those efforts still continue. Teachers that needed the technology via their administrator were able to get that from the district. Internet access, all of those items, we met on a daily basis to talk about where are we, what have we forgotten, what do we need to do, what child needs us, what educators need, how did the leadership need support. So it was really It was really check-ins that lasted 3 to 4 hours about crossing our T's, dotting our I's. Where is the support needed, and how do we fulfill that support to the point where the superintendent, again, just forethought and being able to plan. We all know that the PPEs were not available to anyone in the beginning. And the superintendent, thank goodness for our great staff, and the head of facilities had ordered months before, as he started to hear what was going on outside of the states. And we had just received quite a bit of PPEs that we were able to share with the city and other health agencies that really needed it. That sense of community, that in order to educate a child, it's more than just the paper, the book, and all of that stuff. It's about really feeding the soul, the mind, and the needs of our family and our community. And everything from having conversations is, if we support the police, if we support the hospitals, if we support the city, we're supporting our children. And so those were the conversations we were having in the very beginning. As it has evolved, it's been more about maintaining rigor, albeit sensitivity to the needs of our children and our community. So it's been a lot of those conversations, and then how do we slowly scaffold to our staff, to our families, to our children as we think about reopening. What does that look like? How do we support teachers, student teachers? We had conversations with all constituents and stakeholders, because they're all so important as an adult touching a child and a family. And how do we give one uniform message? And the superintendent was just brilliant as to just how he allowed those ideas and that planning to really trickle down so that it impacts our most prized possession and the reason that we're here, which is to make sure we're supporting children. So it's been very difficult. However, I will say communication, making sure we keep focused. Superintendent has been laser focused on the fact that we're supporting children, and in supporting all our stakeholders, we are therefore supporting children. So although difficult, it has been just a real sort of roll up your sleeves and do what you need to do, and go in there and focus on that. As far as the focus on racial justice and so forth has been one that school education and children come to the school and they gain much of their understanding of what's going on in media with teachers and in the school environment. So having those kinds of conversations and, how are you feeling? What are those mental images and what they're seeing and what they're hearing on TV and what they're seeing outside of their front door? How is that impacting you? And so a lot of those conversations took place with the adults, and that was really powerful. Because the adults, again, we see them as the superintendent always says, is the closest heartbeat to the child. So making sure that we gave the adults a space to be able to speak, and sort of he provided them with a lot of time to kind of deal with their own frustrations and so forth, and,
right.
and kind of support. And then just supporting the teachers to make sure that the children are supported. So that's an ongoing goal and learning curve.
You know what? I think that's actually, and thank you for breaking down everything that was happening with Newark Public Schools. My children attend Newark Public Schools, and so I know firsthand some of the things that I saw in terms of the care and the effort and the concern that just blew me away. You mentioned a couple of things that I think is really important to talk about, especially with regard to the earlier points made by Dr. Wingfield and Dr. Porcher. So first I want to talk about this rigor, right? And I'm going to push back a little bit, because what I found was this need for rigor was clouding the conversation on humanity. Mm-hmm. And I also see this a lot in higher ed, right? So how does our understandings of rigor really kind of impact just conceptions of humanity, right? And so for me, I know for my kids, it was just like, okay, let's talk about the fact that like you won't see your friends right now. Let's go through that. While the teachers like, submit the work now, it's due at the end of the day. And so again, I think it's important. We have to know when to pause. The students will get back. In fact, I would argue my children have learned a lot more being at home. And I also understand that's due to different privileges that I have in my own life. But also it was just the hustle and bustle of it, right? I think the other piece is, and I want to get to some pedagogical questions now. So I'm going to swing back to Dr. Wingfield. But Dr. Mendez, thanks for the breakdown on NPS. We're going to get back to NPS, but I want to circle back to before they even get to NPS, because we are training teachers and we saw a lot of fears, right? Do I still want to get into this? What's going on? Ooh, what's happening? And let's be honest, the teaching profession, especially in urban communities, we don't have people busting down the doors, right? Let me go teach, yes, right? Let's be real. We have people who come in to be nosy, right? To find out what's going on, and then they leave, right? But how do you really sustain teachers in a dynamic place like Newark? And so I want to get back to Dr. Wingfield with this question. Dr. Wingfield, pedagogically, right, from a clinical perspective, training teachers, how do you see teachers being trained differently pedagogically in a more remote setting, since we don't know when we're going to be back live?
So I just want to first acknowledge this theme of humanizing, right? Because I think as a teacher education program, that's something that comes up a lot, specifically an urban teacher education program. Even though like one of our programs are one of the most diverse programs in the state, ethnically, but racially, right? We still have, racially, we still have a lot of students show up and they haven't ever interacted, right, with this many Black people in one space, right? They walk into this building, they've never been surrounded by this many Black people, you know. And shout out to some of our school principals, Central with Dr. Brown, and but because they really gave us the space to do this work with our students who haven't interacted with this many people who don't look like them. So the first piece was getting over that fear, and right, I'm even uncomfortable repeating that, but there was a fear for some students being in these environments. So the first step always is humanizing the students that we're working with. I'm talking about the students of NPS. First humanizing them, humanizing the community, and humanizing the families that you're now going to be interacting with. And I think that's just something we have to continue with throughout. I think we also have to dig more deeply in, this is myself too, right? As somebody who works with students during this clinical phase, is more self-interrogation, right? So we're talking about doing anti-racism work, which I'm afraid is going to be commodified at some point, because now that's the center of the conversation. That's the term we're constantly using. But everybody's talking about anti-racism now. People aren't really talking about culturally relevant. They're kind of dismissing that, but not seeing the correlation between it all. So pedagogically, you know, we really have to be talking about self-interrogation. We have to be looking at white guilt and white fragility, because that comes up as a big piece too. And we have to realize that the precursor to all this work is then developing your critical consciousness, right? So we skip all of that to go to all the practical things. We talk about English content, we talk about social studies. There's a big push for STEM teachers, but what is the work that they're doing with themselves before they're able to enter these communities? But then you have to talk about teacher diversification, because in higher ed, as much as in our schools, a large percentage of the teachers are white. A large percentage of the teachers' socioeconomics don't match those of the students that they'll be working with. So those have to be the conversations that lead the content. And then we have to be talking about how to build that into the content in a way that maintains high expectations for students. Oftentimes as teachers or as educators, we talk about students showing up as blank slates. They're not blank slates. They're coming here with something. And what we're not doing enough of is cultivating the genes and building and starting with what our students have in order to get them to a place where we're equipping them with the cultural capital or the skills to navigate. So we have to find a balance between teaching our students how to value what the students of the district are already coming with, while simultaneously equipping them with the skills to navigate the world that's larger than the city that they'll be working in.
I appreciate that, Dr. Wingfield, especially when you talked about anti-racist work, you feeling it's going to be commodified. I feel that it already is. Absolutely. I think one of my fears for folks on the ground, especially for teachers who have been doing this work forever, community activists, feeling the need to do more right now, and the stress that comes with doing race work, right, is very overwhelming. It's very taxing. And I do want to say that we need more people to do it. We need more people to do it, and without centering whiteness, because I think something that I struggle with too is then it becomes the centering of whiteness, right? Let's talk about white fragility. I don't want to. I've lived it. I live white fragility every day, right? I mean, everybody who's not white, knows what that feels like. But I feel like those are the books, and that's the content that really gets highlighted. And I also think that's really problematic, especially for urban education, because what it does is it takes the attention away from the families and the students that you mentioned, right? And in another kind of thwarted way, it kind of reinforces and reestablishes white supremacy in urban education, which we know is huge because most of the teachers in urban education, right, and in public schools in general, are white. And so how do we center those voices, right? I'm like, Newark is dynamic already, right? It's already dynamic. The students already have that knowledge. They have that skill set. How do we, again, highlight that, right? How do we highlight that to say, this is great, this is good? And so I think that pushes us into thinking about the future of how we want to do this work. And as we train teachers in the fall, right, which is going to be remotely, we need to think about how they're still going to get our social justice vision and mission and the culturally relevant pedagogy without necessarily being in the classroom yet. And so I think that's really hard, but I also think that it's also powerful and it can be done. I want to get to Dr. Porcher. So from a pedagogical perspective, how has this been working out for you? What are you thinking for the future? How is pedagogy going to change now, or how should it change in your opinion?
I just want to echo and just say, Dr. Wingfield, you killed it. Like, this is my stuff. I think it's really interesting, and this is something that we have done wrong in teacher preparation programs, and I'm going to be completely transparent, and in school districts too. When we say urban education, what does that mean, right? And that's a loaded word, especially it's a code word for Black and brown.
Because we really mean Black and brown.
Yes, we really mean Black and brown. And so what has happened is a lot of districts and teacher preparation programs are also making money off of using that word, right? Because that's how you get the grants for diversifying the teaching workforce. That's how you get the funding for your school, right? But what are we really saying when we say urban? And then what happens is we start to use words like, what are the best strategies for teaching in urban education, right? And so I love that Dr. Wingfield started with the self-work. So prior to the pandemic and where we are now, I've always started my work with self-work, and I lean on the work of Dr. Yolanda Ruiz, which is the archaeology of the self, because I don't care how many great strategies I give you. I can teach you culturally relevant pedagogy all day, but if your repository, your actual body, your mind, your spirit is not correct, and you don't believe that Black children can learn, it doesn't matter how many great strategies I give you, you're going to enact harm, right? And so we also have to have a conversation about the fact that a lot of our curriculum, even with a culturally relevant lens that we try to stamp on it, is anti-Black, right? Our school systems are anti-Black. And so our students don't recognize that when they show up in the spaces, they already have negative perceptions about Black and brown children without ever even having any engagement with them. And so as a teacher educator, I'm always unpacking with them, where did that perspective come from? Right? I can't teach you anything about strategies until you can have an honest conversation about the way that you feel about Black and brown children. So I think of my work as a cyclical piece. So we're unpacking ourselves, but what are our perceptions and our perspectives about Black and brown communities, about how we think about poverty, about how we think about urban education? We have to go through that process, and then we get to strategies, and then we reflect, and then we go back to the self, right? So it's cyclical. And what we've done in this work is that we feel like if we create one training or they go through our urban education program, then they've arrived, right? So that's where we see this white liberalism kind of coming out, where people are telling us more about what they know than the actual Black people who have experienced it, right? We all have to make a choice every single day to do this work. Yeah. None of us arrive there, right? And so we have to continue to do this work. And it's not just for white people, it's for Black people too, because we have internalized anti-Blackness, right? I say white supremacy is like smog. We're all breathing it in all the time. So even our idea of rigor has to be interrogated, because who created that knowledge? Who was there, right? Whose voice is missing, whose voice is present. So what we're doing is we're teaching students how to take knowledge from us, but we're not teaching them how to say, who created this knowledge? Where is my voice in this? Where is my ancestors' voice in this? And how do we become critical to actually dismantle our idea of what we think education is? During the pandemic, we've had to have a conversation about the text that we have our students reading, or how they engage in math, or how they engage in science. And we're finding that the way that we have been teaching things has nothing to do with the real world, right? So it's not just an opportunity to keep going with what we've had before. We know that does not work. So we should not be continuing where we left off. We should be dismantling and creating something that actually centers Blackness, which we know our current system does not.
I love that, Dr. Porcher, and I love that you talk about this idea. First of all, shout out to Yolanda Ruiz, because she's in the house. TC graduate, that's my boo. She is phenomenal. And going back to Dr. Wingfield and you talking about the introspection, so that's what our program does. Everything starts with the self. Our students struggle through that. You would think that they would want to reflect, but we have seen, and Dr. Wingfield can speak to some of this too, the ways that our students struggle when we're like, how did you really feel when you walked into that classroom in Newark? What were you really thinking, right? Because you read what they write and it's all this polished, and I saw, right? But then you hear them talking and it's, racialized language and, all these things, right? The anti-Blackness, we've seen this with the teachers that we are preparing, right? Some of them who would be considered the quote unquote well-intentioned, but again, you talked about that white liberalism, right? And that neoliberalism, which is troubling, which is scary. You talk about what it means to be in this space in a Black body, there's already trauma, right? You have things lingering like imposter syndrome, right? And I tell people, imposter syndrome does not exist because we built the school, we belong here, right? But when students in spaces like Newark feel like imposters in their own school, I've seen this too, right? So what does it mean where the community that I grew up in, I feel like an imposter in my local school, right? What if my local school doesn't exist anymore? We're seeing these issues, right? What does it mean to prepare teachers who are afraid to teach in Newark but won't say it in our presence, right? And Dr. Wingfield, I think you could speak to some of that anti-Blackness that we see in some of our students who, we're like, hey, you're gonna go to this site, you're gonna teach in this school, right? Now, after they teach there, they do start some of the unlearning. But again, it's a push. We do these exercises with them. We make them reflect a lot. And so I think what you're saying there is really important. And I think as we move forward, we also have to think of ways to maintain ourselves. Teachers are often thought of as, these saviors, right? Even when it's not said, it's implied that like you're doing some really heavy work. And when you add anti-racist work and culturally responsive pedagogy and social justice education to that, it's really heavy, right? And so I'm really, wellness is really important to me too. I'm really thinking of how can we all do this and push through, but also not die doing this. And I say that for real because so many of us are dying. So many of us have put our health on a back burner because we really don't have time. We really don't. And that scares me, right? Especially because similar to you guys, a lot of these folks are my friends. And I see literally the ways that they are tired, physically drained, emotionally drained, and they just keep going, right? So how do we not die? Some of us are dying, some of us will die for the cause, we know it. But how do we still maintain our sanity and our wellness, right? I want to ask Dr. Mendez a question from the Newark Public Schools level. What kind of wellness systems do you guys have in place from a Newark Public Schools level to ensure that students and families are okay and that teachers are okay too?
So there's an entire office, the Office of Student Life, that sort of supports a lot of the wellness pieces. This includes the social, emotional, working with the guidance counselors, the social workers. And during this time, we've had a lot of loss, obviously. And so a lot of the guidance counselors and a lot of the social workers have been working with that department. We've had everything from making sure that we're visiting with families, albeit making sure that we're very conscious of the social distancing, but we've had the grief baskets, we've had everything from the people who work in the schools to parents to children to try to support them as much as possible through the Office of Student Life. Again, working with the guidance counselors and the social workers, teachers being key. Teachers are always the ones who normally support and or refer students to these support mechanisms, these individuals in the school. So we've kept a lot of those lines of communication open. So we've, although trying and difficult to sort of get to a point where we can be fluid, it's been a lot of work with making sure that, and again, that it's not just the social workers and the guidance counselors, but also that the teachers are aware, checking in. You mentioned, Dr. Belle, about and you all discussed about the humanity piece. There was a time where I think the conversation around the world was, we can't deal with this at home schooling because I use the word rigor. The bottom line is that there was a lot of communication to make sure that we were clear that we don't, when I use the word rigor, it's more as it relates to having high expectations for children versus making it difficult for the sake of making it difficult. Albeit we are aware that there were some individuals that, in not knowing how to handle the situation, I think in some instances there may have been maybe just that whole theme of making sure you understand the situation and not overburden the child and so forth. So there was a lot of communication with teachers around, kids are going through a lot. Parents are going through a lot. Let's make sure you're going through a lot. Let's make sure that you get a sense for what you're asking children to do, what you're asking parents who probably don't have any knowledge of how to use Google Docs and Google Meet, all of these items, and make sure that you're balancing that out with what you're asking the students to do. There was a pausing point where the superintendent was very clear in making sure that we kind of reassessed. And again, through all of our schools, making sure that the leaders were clear. You need to, as you have, learning communities with your teachers and any adult that comes into contact with children, make sure that we're dealing with the social emotional, and we entered into community. There was a lot of back and forth about the learning curve for them as well and balancing that out. So a work in progress. And I think for everyone, it doesn't take a pandemic for there to be a need for humanity. I think there's a need for humanity, period. And I think in understanding sort of how to balance out the needs of the whole child in order to move forward sort of the agenda in making sure that you do have high expectations, and sort of balancing out. When I say rigor again, it's sort of balancing out. Don't dummy the work either because they can't do it, but also have a sense of what are these kids going through, what are these families going through, and make sure it's equitable. And the whole equity conversation, of course, we can go for hours on that conversation, but to make sure that what you're doing is fair, makes sense, and making sure that we were really trying to meet the needs of all stakeholders as much as we can. And it's like a sine curve. There were ups and downs. We'd stop, pause, and say, can we reassess? And in some instances, I think they were better. We were doing better than in others, but certainly the conversation was there, which was an eye opener for some individuals that maybe had not stopped to think about that or to even consider, sort of looking at the child as a whole child. So there was a lot of conversations that student life group and just speaking to the leaders, because it is a top down. The leaders need to lead, and if the leaders are demanding the teachers to do a certain level of work, the teachers are going to feel that stress. And so to make sure that, I know the superintendent had a lot of conversation to just, how are you doing? How are the kids doing? How are the families doing? Let's take a pausing point. So we did that every so often, and I think that that's necessary. But also just as far as just the student life department really did a great job of really putting a face to the school district and the superintendent, and everything from just being able to have celebrations that still matter to our kids, and they love being around other adults and other children, because when something happens, that's their family in some instances. And so he personally, and just as an executive staff, and then everyone that we supervise, make sure that we can really put a face and do the best that we can, either virtually or actually, take something to their home. We're proud of you. So we did all this. We continued the celebrations. If you did well, celebrate it. If you're hurting, be there. We just needed to kind of define what that be there looked like. But it was a lot of don't skip a beat. And these kids need you more than ever. These families need you more than ever. How do we supply that need? So it was a lot of trying to just the first casualty that we had or just loss that we had in the district. We just made sure that we went out in mass and we supported and said, we feel that, we hear you. And that was, and just to try to really give it a name and say, this is something terrible that we can't wrap our brain around. And this was an integral part of this huge organization. And it still mattered for us to go out there and be human about, someone else from the district has passed. And that's never been the tone. So just putting, and I really appreciated your term of humanizing it. And that's sort of, it's a balancing act, right? We're trying to be really good at what we do, but at the same token, we need to just have a lot of conversations around what does that look like? have high expectations for our kids, high expectations, because just because they're brown and black doesn't mean they can't. However, in the midst of this situation, how do we just adjust that a bit? So there was a lot of conversations around that, still are, and we're just working really hard to get it right.
Thank you, Dr. Mendez. You know, I appreciate a lot of what you said, specifically about, you know, clearing up what you meant when you said rigor. I also, though, want to dive deep and connect that to Dr. Porcher's point about anti-Blackness. You know, the assumptions about what Black and brown children can or can't do are rooted in racism, right? The high expectations language and framework is rooted in racism. And in Newark, in a place that was really taken over by a lot of charter schools, I think it's really important to have that conversation about what that triggers when you hear high expectations and what it does to some parents. I can say firsthand that I do believe that NPS is doing a good job in partnering. You guys are a great partner to us. You always have been. And we've always had that kind of open door policy. So I appreciate that. I also want to make sure that we're touching on some of the things that are really complex about a space like Newark, and trying to really push through with removing that kind of anti-Blackness from curriculum that we see, or teachers' biases that we see in the classroom due to a lack of proper training or professional development. And so that's why we programmatically really try to take care of that before our students are actually teachers. We really go through a process of preparing them to be social justice educators, not just in theory, but really in practice, and not only in the classroom, but in your life, right? If we really want to talk about this as work, if I only keep my social justice actions for conversations like this, and when I'm around other like-minded people, then it's going to stay in these really small pockets. But if it's a way of life and it's happening everywhere, then I'm going to do it everywhere. So I do have kind of one more point to make before we look at some questions. So there's a James Baldwin quote that is really dear to me. And it's, to act is to be committed, and to be committed is to be in danger. And I want to say it again, to act is to be committed is to be in danger. And I do believe that if we're really committed to creating new pathways in urban education, there is some danger that comes with that, because the way these systems are designed, as we all know, there's a lot of bureaucracy, and it's really hard to really push through for some new things to change lives, but there's little danger, right? And so are we really ready to kind of push against the status quo and push against things that we know are wrong, right? Especially going back to the earlier conversation with Dr. Wingfield was kind of talking about this humanization process and really wanting to say, if I don't feel humanized as a teacher, right, how can I then, right, make my students feel humanized? If I don't feel humanized as a faculty member, right, how am I going to magically, and by the way, faculty members, right, are doing this all the time, right? And so again, we have to start humanizing all around. We have to push against this top-down approach to teaching and learning and understanding. And the only way we can do this is with compassion and with the introspection. So one of the last questions I want to ask you guys, one thing I've noticed is the schedule, right? The schedule, that hustle and bustle, even school timeframes, we see that that wasn't working for most students everywhere. What is your commitment, right, to changing one thing in your specific role? What commitment do you have to changing one specific thing in your role? So I'll tell you, for me, as the director of the Urban Teacher Education Program, I personally am committed to just slowing down, okay? And by slowing down, I mean slowing down in my classes. I don't have to give 100 assignments to assess a student, right? But really slowing down. And I say that because when you're a teacher education program with a lot of state demands, trust me, slowing down is very hard to do. So I want to ask that question to Dr. Wingfield. What is your commitment for yourself and your respective role? And how do you think you're going to push through with that?
So I'm going to echo some of what you're saying, because as teacher education preparation programs, we're on a constant go, 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 go. because we have these state mandates to meet, but we have all this content and pedagogy that we really want to impress upon our students before they move out into being full-time teachers. And then we have the additional burden as Black faculty. I'm sorry, I'm adding Dr. Porcher back in because we lost her for a second. But there's the additional pressure as specifically Black faculty, Black staff to show up for all students of color, for all Black students in a way that's not demanded of others, right? So we have all these additional responsibilities and moving forward with the work. So one of the things that I do too, would like to do is slow down. I think we try to get a lot into the curriculum, a lot done in these short amount of weeks that are built into one semester. And I want to dedicate a little bit more of that time to allowing for reflection, but also more time to that relationship building because it becomes overwhelming, right? I'm offering myself to students in a way that's really not feasible on top of all the demands of the university, of these institutions. So really looking to find that balance between the two, with understanding, because my commitment is so, like, I'm showing up in Newark, like as a native, as a former student, now as a member of Rutgers-Newark. So really thinking about the ways that I could, you can't do it all, but trying to figure it out, but take my time and still allow for healing within myself as I do the work.
No, I feel that. I feel that, sis. I feel that. And I love you, but you know that. Dr. Porcher, tell us.
We lost her again.
We lost her again? Okay, so it's okay. We're going to get to Dr. Mendez. What is your commitment in your role as the executive director of HR? What is your commitment to doing something that's going to really help push urban education forward?
I think one of the biggest pieces is making sure that as we hire and as we are recruiting, we have been getting a lot of interest for our school district, most recently from institutions that don't really have, when we ask for student candidates, for student teachers or interns, we would like to also see, first of all, I love the idea of it being a heart matter. I think Dr. Portia mentioned that, but also our kids want to see adults that look like them. And we've been getting a lot of interest from organizations and universities that don't always have that cadre of candidates. And so that's important. And calling that the fact that we should be recruiting from programs such as the one at Rutgers, the Urban Education program, but also just looking at historic Black colleges and other institutions that are really, they have a vision, and that hopefully it's not just because it's compliancy or it looks good on a piece of paper on a grant, as both of you mentioned, which is convenient for discretionary funding, but that really that they're as the panelists here have just shared, that we have candidates that when they come, I think there is an element of relatability without a doubt when you can be a teacher in the environment that looks very similar to something that you can say, I feel you. I've been there. I know what you're talking about. So there's that level as far as our recruitment and our hiring to make sure that that we have adults that are coming in, whether it be interns, whether it be who we are really focusing on recruiting, that we're being very intentional of making sure we're going to historic Black colleges, making sure that we're also going into or working with organizations and universities that are promoting urban education and are really in line with just the needs of our students. So that's one of the big pushes that we are moving forward. And as far as doing different, one of the things we want to do is we want to be intentional about that. And we've started that work, but we want to move forward with a great deal of intentionality in that area.
Absolutely, I love that. And again, as I told you, our relationship with Newark Public Schools has been powerful. My own personal relationship with Newark Public Schools, and I want to continue to strengthen that relationship. No school district is perfect, right? So I think that some things that we've noticed, Dr. Wingfield and I, especially as we try to recruit really strong cooperating teachers, we look to see if they've got those things in place. And the reality is that a lot of teachers need help A lot of teachers have the language, but in terms of the action in the classroom, it doesn't always look like social justice, right? And sometimes familiarity breeds contempt, right? Sometimes you've been teaching for so long, you think you know all about Newark, and and I go in there and I'm like, okay, wait a minute, time out. And so I think as long as we're willing to hold each other accountable, but also, again, just have these humanizing conversations, like, I know you're doing a hard job, how can we work together? How can we collaborate? I think that's the way to go. Dr. Wingfield, I wanted us to have an opportunity in the last 2 minutes to answer a couple of questions. Are there any questions there up on the live?
Let's see.
I'm gonna look on my phone as well.
Bear with me because I'm not that savvy here with this.
Okay, I see some questions.
Okay.
Okay.
Can you read them, Dr. Belle? Because I'm having a difficult time seeing them.
Okay. So some of the questions I see, what is the new normal for school in September? I can start. I think the new normal is the commitment to understanding that things will never be the same. And I think that people are really struggling with that, right? That people are like, when are we going to get back to normal? And it's never going to be normal, even for our students, for families, especially for families who've lost a lot of financial income. Guys, that's a lot of families in Newark right now. A lot of families in Newark have been hit economically in a major way. And so I think the first step is understanding there won't be a new normal, but there will be something different, right? From what I can gather, it looks like most schools will still be working on a remote schedule in the fall. It's still being finalized in New Jersey, but I know, they're saying maybe only 10 students in the classroom or 20 with masks, but that's still being finalized. I think what we do know is there are things that we can do online that we can do really well. And so we have to be thinking, maybe it's a hybrid teaching and learning model, right? But then thinking about parents who have to go back to work, there's that piece. So I think there are a lot of layers. I think the one answer is being committed to a new normal, putting students first, but then also putting parents' livelihood first. And I say that because in a space like Newark, I know firsthand in my community, in my neighborhood, in my family, let me just keep it real, where unemployment is a real thing, right? And so we want to be mindful of employment for families, how that impacts students, how they're showing up to school after COVID, if I've lost some family members after COVID, right? Really making those students seen and creating curriculum that addresses COVID, guys, right? So let's start getting some writing done in classrooms and talking about this from a historical standpoint, from a cultural standpoint, but don't push it under the rug when students are finally back in school, right? That you're now gonna go back to the content. I would say that's a major takeaway from my perspective. Programmatically, I told you guys I'm slowing down. I'm doing things slower. We're tackling things that will be academically inquisitive and challenging, but also just humanizing too. Dr. Wingfield.
So the new normal, I think as far as like logistically what it looks like, Dr. Belle, I think you hit all of the points there. I think as far as like pedagogy goes, we have to recenter a lot of conversations that we as people of color were already having, right? But now we have a sharper, deeper lens and greater interest on the conversations that we've always been having. So really now taking this as an opportunity.
Say it again, Dr. Wingfield, say it again.
We've always talked about this, right? We've always been having these conversations. So what are the ways that we can now use this as an opportunity to encourage more people to do some unlearning and relearning, right? But I think we also have to be mindful as people of color not to take that on as a full burden, inviting people into this conversation and thinking about what that looks like. I think it's also the opportunity for us to be reconsidering what curriculum is looking like. Dr. Porcher earlier, who I'm trying to get back in, and won't let her back in, but thinking about curriculum, looking at how it is anti-Black, how white liberalism shows up, how neoliberalism shows up, thinking about the language we're using in these spaces, and again, re-interrogating it all so that we are ensuring that our students are getting what they need when they show up into these school spaces. So I think we have more freedom and flexibility. We have more eyes on what's happening and more people with a greater interest in learning. I would warn people of only doing the reading, right? Because we have all these book lists out now. We have all these conversations about what we should read, but okay, wait. I think she's back. So we're having everybody talk about what we should be reading, but now we have to be thinking about what are the action steps that align with the readings that we're going to be doing in order to move forward with this work.
Preach, preach.
Jhanae, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Dr. Porcher.
But I can't see myself. The devil is busy, y'all.
The devil
I can't see myself.
Well, can you jump in to at least answer this last question that Dr. Belle asked?
Sure, Dr. Belle, can you repeat the question?
Absolutely. First of all, Dr. Porcher, I want to say I'm glad that we have you back for the and one. Okay, because we know you fine. We know you fine. So my question was, I mentioned the James Baldwin quote: "To act is to be committed. To be committed is to be in danger." And the question was, what is your commitment to this new normal come the fall?
That's a word. So there's a couple different things that I am committed to. The first thing that I'm committed to is making sure that I'm taking care of myself. I know I got cut off right when you said, Dr. Belle, that this work is killing a lot of us. And I think about the physical and emotional trauma that happens to Black people when they experience racism, right? And so I'm thinking about my own physical body, because at the end of the day, I want to be in the fight for freedom, but I can't be in the fight if I'm not taking care of myself. But the second thing that I am also committed to is holding my white counterparts accountable. What I find is that, and I've been receiving a lot of emails, hey, can you sit on this committee? Hey, can you do this? Hey, can you do that? And I think it's extremely important for people to listen to Black women, listen to brown women, and our understanding of this work, but listen to us, but the practice is ours, but the work is theirs, right? And so I'm thinking about Dr. Bettina Love's book, and she talks about how asking Black people to dismantle racism is actually racism, right? And so I popped in on what Dr. Wingfield was saying when she said, I want you to read, but then I want you to get into action, right? And so we know that we have a lot of white counterparts that are not speaking up when they know that they see racism present against their Black colleagues or against their brown colleagues. So using their voices to stand up for people. But then I'm going to take it a step further and saying that you got to put your privilege on the line. It's one thing for you to talk about, hey, we have injustices, but there is another thing for you to actually put your privilege on the line and say that you're going to do something about it. So for example, in our hiring practices, being in a faculty role, when we're hiring people and we're looking at how much we're going to pay them, and we know that we're not paying a Black or a brown person enough, you have to be the person that speaks up and say that, hey, we're not doing this way, and this is the way that we need to do it. Or if an opportunity presents itself and you know there should be a Black person at the table and it's a room full of white people, you're actually saying, hey, why is there no Black people at the table here, and why haven't we invited them? And not just the Black people who know how to adhere to respectability politics, the Black people who actually push back on the way that we think and the way that we move through the world, right? That doesn't serve Black and brown people, because what I found is that they will invite the Black and brown people who are very nice to them and make them feel comfortable in their white supremacy, but they don't want to invite the Black and brown people who actually require that they have to dismantle something. So making sure that we invite everyone to the table to actually get this work done. And the third thing that I would say, and it's just simply put, stop killing us, right? So the interesting thing is that we all want to have these conversations with Black people, but I need you to talk to your families. I need you to talk to your brothers. I need you to talk to your uncles at home and tell them to stop killing my nephew, stop killing my brothers, right? So we have to have that critical conversation. The work has to start with self, and it has to start in your home. It doesn't start in our careers. It doesn't start, oh, I got that one Black friend. No, I need you to have that conversation with your family at the table, because I'm sorry, but these kids grow up to kill Black people. Right. And so we have to have those critical conversations, and it can't happen just Black people having the conversations with their children about all of the things that they have to do well. That stuff has to start at home. So I would say the first thing, making sure that I keep myself alive and this thing doesn't kill me. The second thing is holding my white counterparts accountable, but also making sure that they're doing the work, because I'm hearing a lot of white people say, well, just tell Black people to vote. No, I need you to tell your white counterparts don't kill my folks, period.
I feel you, Kisha. Kisha, what a word. Listen, you came back here. You came back here and took us to church. Okay. So I love everything that you said. It's so direct and it's so true. And I think one of the things that I struggle with in education right now is, people are afraid to tell the truth. And so I really appreciate your truth telling. And thank you for bringing up interest convergence and critical race theory. So Dr. Porcher is talking about interest convergence, which is essentially the idea that white folks are not willing to support Black folks unless interest money, they're going to benefit from it in some way, right? And so what ends up happening is, well, what do you think happens? I'll leave that to you. Leave that in the comments, right? You have to be willing to share some of those resources, and a lot of people are not. And so I think it's really important that you bring that up. Stop killing us, right? You're killing me in the street. You want me to come to work happy, creating programs. Sorry, I'm tired today, right? So I think it's really important that we speak on that. I want to give Dr. Mendez an opportunity to quickly respond before we wrap up. Dr. Mendez, would you like to talk about what is your commitment at NPS? What is your commitment, something that you are going to commit to for the fall?
So I think, as I mentioned before, I think being very deliberate about our recruitment, which I said earlier, and how we focus that recruitment that's the work, because a lot of our the teachers that we need, they're out there, and it's just refocusing. One of my big commitments is I can't do this alone, right? So I think we need to name it, call it, and we've begun that work. But what is the strategy? But more importantly, what's the vision? And to be able to call it and to be able to say, this is important to us. Our kids need it. It's going to make us better as an organization. But also when I look at my world here in HR, again, originally being in the classroom and originally being in a building, the reality of what happens more often than not in the recruitment staffing may not. I need the individuals that are responsible for supporting the district in doing that. They need to see a face behind what the eventually what's the gain when we have the right person in front of our children. And that may mean leaving central office and going to see what a school looks like, and the reality of the work that gets done here and the impact of that in classrooms. So that work of siloing our work and making it very task oriented is something that right now I think is very important for me, so that they can see whenever you recruit well, whenever you are envisioning the work and the strategy behind the vision, it's because of this. And let me explain to you what this really is, because some of the people, well-intentioned, as we've been saying, sometimes they just don't get, they've not been there, they haven't walked the walk, and I'm not, it is what it is. However, let me explain for you that if you're going to be a part of this organization, that's the goal. So I think we need to name it. We need to give it a face, so to speak. We need to say these kids need that level of us rising to the occasion, and you being maybe a little uncomfortable. And when we're looking for someone, we need to be deliberate. But if we're working in silos and we're thinking we're just doing what we've been doing, we're going to get the same results. And that's not my goal. So next year, this coming year, our focus, as I mentioned before, is being very deliberate, naming it, not being afraid of naming it, which I personally am not, but I think it's important that we need to take some time to really say, this is what we're doing, this is why, and making sure that everyone that's going to support that has their piece, their hand in it, to make sure that, within their networks, they're not only learning from it, but they're being a part of the solution.
Thank you, Dr. Mendez. So I do want to say, as I wrap up, I want to say, you know, before the discussion to have this conversation came to be, I was really struggling with a lot of the emotions I was feeling, first and foremost as a mother, right? As a wife. Like it wasn't even in that sphere yet, right? And then thinking like something could happen to my children, right? You have Ayanna Stanley Jones, who was 7 years old, right? Killed in bed. And I'm naming these folks so that we need to be mindful that education is not separate from this, right? This is happening. It's happening in communities, in urban communities, nationwide. And I want to go back to something Dr. Porcher said. She said, and what is urban? And you know, one of the first things we do in our program, I put urban down on the board and I have them talk about it at a recruitment event. And it's intentionally to hear the things they say. And you should hear the things that come out. You know, they say, you know, dangerous. And I said, you know, what about sophisticated? What about beautiful? What about, and it's amazing how their minds are like, oh, right? And so really pushing folks to reconceptualize how they see urban and how they see the term urban education. Why? Really getting folks to investigate the anti-Blackness that was discussed in today's conversation, right? The fact that we need to talk about humanity in the space of education. Just think about how crazy that is, that we have to talk about it, that there are entire books, Humanize the Children, right? For people who choose teaching professions, right? Taking care of self, right? And those of you who know me know I'm big on taking care of the self. Dr. Porcher mentioned that repeatedly. Dr. Wingfield mentioned that, the self-introspection. You've got to take care of yourself, right? Talking about from an NPS level, what kinds of teachers are we recruiting and why? Are we just recruiting folks who have that certification, right? We have to be really strategic in who we're recruiting and why. And then again, thinking about this idea of what is social justice really, right? If there's anti-Blackness in this world, how do I create a social justice vision and mission in a world that is racist, in a world that is anti-Black? And I'm gonna leave you guys with that. Listen, I wanna say, I have to give these shout outs. Dr. Wingfield, I love you. We work side by side. And as Black women doing this work, I just want to say shout out to you because I feel like that's not really publicly shared in these spaces, right? Dr. Porcher, thank you for just coming in and just, you know, doing this work and not even being hesitant about joining this panel. Dr. Mendez, thank you, right, for coming through and saying, yes, I'll be there. I'll represent NPS. And I want to say Newark Public Schools has been a great partner to us. Thank you guys. Listen, Black Lives Matter, okay? Take care of yourself, take care of your bodies. Follow us, you know, I gotta let y'all know, Rutgers-Newark. Follow us, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Thank you for being here, and we plan to have more conversations like this, for real, for real.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Sorry, guys, I don't know what happened, but it was nice chatting with you all.
All right, bye, guys.
Thank you so much, Dr. Porcher.
Thank you, Dr. Belle, and Dr. Wingfield, and Dr.
I was like, where did she go? So thank you. I'm so happy you came back.